This is the pertinent question. I think it's fantastic hearing from the previous speakers, in that there's an awful lot that we can learn from different places in Europe, different places in America, and they seem to have ways in delivering nice places to live that we have problems with. And so what I'd just like to talk about is really some of the practical elements of how we can deliver places and some of our experiences in doing that. And so really the answer to that question, in my view, is this. It's really, what is it that people want? I don't think in my experience that there's actually a negative reaction to development per se. It's what sort of development is appropriate, what sort of development actually helps places grow rather than diminish by just being overrun by boring, bland housing estates. So that's the answer. And, well, we can all go home now, I suppose. But anyway, a bit more complicated than that. So the first thing I want to talk about is what I call the extraordinary event. And it involves this guy here talking about this project. It's not the guy just yet. What I'm talking about is a proposal to build 42 houses on a greenfield site adjacent to a town called Totnes in Devon, which is where we're based, which has a very strong history of protest against new development. And what I wanted to talk about was this guy here, and this is Rhodri Samuel, who is the new chief exec of Dartington Hall Trust. Now, Dartington Hall own quite large swathes of land around Totnes, and they have, in previous decades, funded their core aims and objectives of sustainability, social entrepreneurship, fundamental well-being for people by selling large lumps of this land to developers. And a couple of years ago, this really came to a head, and this is rather an unkind photograph, but here's the previous chief exec of Dartington Hall Trust after he was severely criticized for this policy by a very vociferous local group called Don't Bury Dartington Under Concrete. They were very effective in getting news coverage to highlight the fact that this charitable trust was just selling land to developers to destroy the very place in which they existed in order to fund some of their ongoing social activities, things like this, presenting a coffin at the chief exec's office as the symbolism of how they were destroying the local community. So you can imagine that when there was a proposal to build even more houses next to Dartington, that there was going to be rioting in the streets. And so, sorry, I'm going back a bit. This was the thing, the straw that broke the camel's back was this development by a perfectly good and reasonably local developer who did better than the usual sorts of thing, but it wasn't what people wanted, and it wasn't delivering what, in fact, is Dartington. Now, what people like to think of as Dartington, what people who live there like to think of Dartington, is this sort of thing. It's a relatively typical collection of Devon hamlets, actually. It's quite a widespread area, but there's a lot of nice stuff that people identify with. Certainly, these are the most photographed buildings in Dartington. Nobody takes pictures of the new housing estates, and they see that as being part of their local identity. So that when Rhodri stood up and said, we are going to build 42 new houses on this greenfield site to this particular group, several months ago, he actually got a round of applause, which is, for me, was quite an extraordinary event. So I've labeled it the extraordinary event. Because his predecessor probably would have got booed out of the room, and the campaign groups were there in force and ready to let their views be known. And the reason was that because of this history of dissatisfaction amongst the locals, Dartington had been proactive. They'd actually brought Rhodri in as an advisor to say, how do we sort this out with the community? They instigated a housing conference, which Matthew chaired a couple of years ago, and decided that they were going to try and do things differently. And so if they are going to do things differently, the main question was, how do you turn these people, at their own suggestion, from NIMBYs into SWIMBYs, Swimbies being something wonderful in my backyard. So we ran a series of workshops. Now, when you ask people about development, the first reaction from locals generally is they just don't want development. But if for all of the reasons that we've already heard, we realize that there must be development, then what sort of new development do people want? And again, that is a very, very large question to ask a group of lay people who are not professional planners or urban designers of any sort. But what do they want? And what we did in this particular case, we asked this question, and so we began to look at what existed in the parish itself. We looked at various places. We looked at the things that had happened in the past. And in particular, what I did was get people to look at the patterns and the relationships of those places, because in my view, that's the first thing that you need to do. Everywhere has a unique pattern. These are examples of places that people didn't like too much. I've got the plan here to illustrate the layout. And as we went through we did walkabouts and tours and things, we began to get places that were more approved of, and there began to be a commonality of themes about them, in that there was clustering of buildings, and in particular, there was one place that everyone seemed to like a lot, which was a clustering of buildings around with a lot of pedestrian access, a lot of nooks and crannies, lots of little corners and things, which was around a central green space. And here is the plan of that. And that's therefore began to get people to think about what is it that is offensive about new development generally. And one of the primary things is that the place that you hold dear to yourself and your family, and perhaps your extended family in the history of the place, is being undermined by development that looks like it could be anywhere. And one of the first things to do if you're going to build in a new place is to say, how do we make more of this existing place? How do we make it better? How do we make it more energy efficient? How do we make it more sustainable? But first of all, what does it look like as a place? What are the key characteristics? So instead of importing a housing estate, which could be Swindon or anywhere else in the UK, how do we build something which is actually of that place? And that was a major consideration amongst the people of Dartington. How is that going to happen? And then there was build it for people, not cars. That was another fundamental thing. How do we make places that are actually enjoyed and lived in by people rather than just conduits for people to drive through and park? And the next, and sense of place and all of those sorts of things. Now, a couple of times in this presentation, I'm going to refer to the viability of these sorts of developments, because when I discuss this with with the people who are involved in our sorts of projects, quite often the thing comes out, oh, wouldn't that be lovely? That would be great to build little wibbly-wobbly cottages, but we can't because it's too expensive and it just doesn't fit any sort of business plan. And just by way of example, this cottage here is in that little clustering around the green, and it needs a lot of work. It's actually a semi-detached. It's got one bathroom. It's got a lot of problems like damp and dry rot and stuff, and it's being sold at £500,000. It's about £400 a square foot. Now, the development that everyone complained about was selling actually a much better house. It's much more energy efficient. It's probably a bit larger. It's got proper parking spaces. It's got a larger garden for that price, which is almost half per square foot. Now, I just don't understand why developers don't take notice of that. Little consideration there is that you have something that people want, they will pay more for it, and in the end everyone's much more happy because the developers have a sausage machine to run. They like churning out the standard boxes, but on the other hand, they're not actually running a very good business model in doing so. But anyway, that's probably another conference. So this is the beginnings of the work at Dartington for the plantation site. It's a layout which focuses around pedestrian greens. It's quite a constrained site. It's a bit long and thin. Excuse me, I'm just going to get a drink of water here. And people seem to like it. Okay, now, there were two reasons they liked it, one of which I've not touched on yet. One is that it respected the local patterns, and this is just indicative boxes put in the pattern to illustrate the pattern. But the second thing that Dartington did was say, we want this to be custom built. And that means that you, as an interested party, can be involved in the creation of this new neighborhood. You can go through and you can buy yourself a plot, and from a range of options, you can actually get your own house built, which will be unique to you. And that meant that a lot of people who were ready to criticize, ready to protest, became engaged in it and said, well, heck, I wouldn't mind living there. Maybe this is something that I can be involved with. The first thing that people became interested in is that if that's the plot they would like, what's going to happen on either side? So they immediately begin to talk and wonder about the adjoining plots. Is there any sort of control over those? What's the materials? What's the size? And all those things. So there was a whole process of sorting all of that out through a design code, which the planners were very keen to embrace and work with, so that anyone buying into this neighborhood would have reassurance that the houses either side were going to be of the same sort, and that there was a lot of getting together whilst the thing was being designed, which meant that people felt it was part of a new place that was being delivered for Dartington. Now, so custom build, which I'll come back to in a minute, was a very critical factor in getting that to work and getting people engaged with it. Now, before the term custom build was coined, we built something, called the Wintles in Bishop's Castle in Shropshire. Bishop's Castle's a little hill town in the middle of South Shropshire. So I'm from Shropshire originally, which looks a little like this in the main street. And 2003, we started building the Wintles, which looks like this. And because we had a process whereby we were building, and we had a little timber frame building workshop on site, people were buying the houses off plan. We were modifying them as people wanted them, but as within the constraints of the planning consent that we had. But we still had a number of important things, which I think was pedestrian priority, keep the cars around the back, use footpaths and things. Where you do have vehicles coming up to buildings, use natural things to traffic calm them, like this large rock stops people driving on the grass. It's very effective. You've got constraints, gateways, identifiable neighborhoods, clusters of houses of about 12 or so. That's enough people who can sit around a kitchen table and make decisions about that bit of grass in the middle of their space without having to go to formal committees and directors and so on. A lot of shared ownership spaces. Well, I'll just flick through these. And it's worked quite well. It's 10 years old now, and we can go back and talk to the residents, and they're still quite pleased to live there. Not many houses have been resold, and certainly the ones that have collected an enormous premium. But cars generally put away around the back in carports rather than garages stuck on the front of the buildings. And by creating a plan with lots of nooks and crannies and corners and things, people put their own stuff in it. And that's what brought it to life. It became theirs, even though technically, legally, it's part of a shared space, it's theirs. And it's just what happens in any traditional village that works in that way. You're not quite sure whether that pot plant is on the pavement or in someone's garden, but it's what adds to that transition space. Allotments, some fairly funky house designs, I think. Lots of sun spaces and things like balconies, which meant that people speak to each other and connect. And it has worked. There's a very good community there. And there was some recent stuff about, what was it? I forgot the name of the place now. The Mediterranean diet that everyone's raving about, being you should eat things with olive oil and all those sorts of things, is not actually strictly true. The fact that the Mediterranean diet works is a lot because of those Mediterranean communities are very strong and supportive, and everyone talks to each other, and they don't. They have more exercise, but they sit down and they chat and they spend a lot of time eating. So the fact that you build a community is very important for a lot of reasons, which are other than aesthetic or financial. But back to the finances, it's the people buy a place. People will buy an ugly house in an attractive neighborhood, but they won't buy an attractive house in an ugly neighborhood. And an ugly neighborhood can mean all sorts of things. It can mean blandness, it could mean aggressive architecture, it can mean all sorts of things. But that if anyone's worried that this is not possible for financial reasons, it's not true. It really works very well. So, a bit of data on where we got to. Places like Poundbury, 15% premiums, and so on. You know, it's a viable proposition. That's just not an excuse. I'm probably over-laboring that point, but it's about lifestyle. It's about living in a sort of perhaps a gentler way. It's about knowing your neighbours. It's about feeling as though you're part of somewhere. And it's about the people who are already in a place feeling as though their place is being expanded rather than just being used as a platform for maybe a house builder to make some money out of by rolling out an estate that could be anywhere. So it's about building places that people want to live in. So it's about this sort of thing, not this sort of thing. And I think this is not far from Totnes, actually, but it could be Cranbrook. It's quite close to Cranbrook that Matthew spoke about. And I think this is what people fear, because not only is it somehow aesthetically damaging to a local community, it brings an awful lot of what's the word, behavior that undermines local communities, undermines villages as well. It encourages people to use cars. It encourages people to be relatively antisocial. It's all that sort of stuff, which is, I think, it's difficult for a group of local plan attendees to really articulate, but that's really what they're sort of worried about. And then we do have architectural solutions, and my comment about architecture is that it really must listen to what people want rather than be focused on a design-led solution simply for that sake. It's really architecture, and I'm not against funky architecture, but it must work and it must show that it'll be sustainable by people adopting it, living in it, possibly adapting it, and loving it in the future. Otherwise, it's going to be changed or demolished, which is a disaster. And lack of funding isn't an excuse. Quickly through here, because these are the prices that we got on our houses, generally 30% per square foot uplift compared to neighbouring new builds in the same place. So, custom build. As with Dartington, and I think with the couple of developments that we've done, it's been a key factor in getting people involved in it, getting people engaged with it. And so custom build allows people to have a unique house that's theirs, but they don't have to go through all the pain of doing a self-build and contractors and all those sorts of things. It is like buying the Volkswagen car with the options as just described. And what I felt was also interesting here is that when we asked the people of Totnes what sort of houses they wanted, these are the photographs that they sent us. And so there was also a feeling that, yes, there's a lot of interest in grand designs, but when it comes down to it, there's also a lot of interest in people living in hobbit houses or whatever it is. You know, you have to, and it's important to acknowledge that. I think that sometimes along the line you see some fantastic, beautiful, cool and edgy schemes, but then you think, well, is that really what people want? I don't know. But price dictates it, and some other ones. Now, this is a development that I think is very interesting in the context of how these sorts of things can be rolled out, and the way that one of the reasons the examples cited in America and Holland and so on don't happen in the UK is because the house builders have a large degree of control over the market. They control the land supply. They've got options on just about every little bit of land that's coming up for planning or development under the present regime and system, and so they are really in charge and they dictate the rules. And let's face it, if you want to live in a particular area, you have to take what's given by the house builders. If that's where you are, there's very little choice. It's not like cars. You can't go to a different shop and buy a different car because you have to live in that particular place. And if it's only those developers beginning with P and B and Z who are doing it, then that's your choice. There's very little. Or you go and buy an existing house, and that's probably why most people don't look at new builds. But this is an interesting example of a guy called Pete Thompson, who is a he farms several hundred acres, runs a company called George Thompson, his father, and if any of you have ever eaten crispy fried seaweed in a Chinese restaurant, you've probably eaten some of Pete's cabbage. I'm sorry to tell you that, but that's what it is. And so he runs a vast horticultural business, running lorries into Covent Garden and so on. And he has a field which has consent for 51 houses that house builders have been pestering him to sell to them. And he's decided instead to build within his orchards a new neighborhood that he feels will be an enhancement to the existing village. And so we've got together and we're beginning to do that. And so we've done a layout for it, which is similar to the other designs that we've done, in that it's pedestrianized, it's shared green spaces, and this one has something called the Edible Avenue running right through the middle of it, which is all part of his fruit tree operation, and there's actually a distillery around the corner. There's also a church and a school and a doctor's surgery and village hall and shop. So the doctor's surgery is going in first, by the way, village shop and hall shortly to follow that. But the fundamental thing is that here you have a landowner who is land rich but cash poor. But on the other hand, through the process of custom build, he can actually act like a house builder, because we can work a different finance model in that we're helping him with the infrastructure, the design, the planning, preparing the plots, and then the people who are going to build there actually come in, agree to buy the plot, and that's what provides the finance for the building of the houses. And so we've now linked that to a off-site manufacturer who does about 3,000 houses a year. He's very interested in supplying these. He's saying if someone wants a house built within 8 weeks, we will be able to hand them the front door keys to that house. So we're able to use this resource in the same way as a house builder might and deliver these sorts of houses. And here's a picture of a little wibbly wobbly house in Great Oakley, which everyone takes photographs of. And so this is the first of the house types from that. I don't know how to make this run. Does it run? And if not, we'll just move it on. Just to give you an idea, we don't have to look at all of this. But with custom build, it's very important that people see what they might get early on, and using CGI is a really important way to do that. This is showing a house on a plot which is fully featured. We get detailed consent for that, and people don't have to build that particular house. They have to use the footprint, but they can have a 3-bed instead of a 5-bed. They can have bells and whistles, or they can build it as cheaply as possible, but they will be restricted to a palette of materials and colors and so forth for the exteriors. And it will finish now. But it's a great way to get people interested. And so we've got this modular system that other people will talk about, so I will whiz through it. But it's all common sense, really. It's car manufacturing for house building. We offer various options, like this. So if house builders were in the same business as car manufacturing, they'd probably be where sort of Austin Rover are now, because it's important you listen to that market, but they have the luxury of not doing so, so they don't. Glendevon, another site that we did, and this is by special request, is the video for this, which, do we want to run it?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay.
2 minutes, 30 seconds.
2 minutes, 30 seconds, okay. Well, that's about right then, and I think, if I can get this thing to run again. This is another CGI of a detailed planning consent. Hasn't been built as yet, but it gives you an idea of the sort of places we could build if we look at pedestrianisation and what works as additions to existing settlements. Enough?
No, well, afterwards.
Okay, yeah, this is it. This is the grand finale. So the idea is here is that, which one of these houses do you want? Let's look at that. Let's look at the cost of it. Let's look at the options. But you get an idea of what the overall place is going to be like. And hopefully it gives you some comfort that it's not going to be too bad. And this is all detailed consent. It's not outside the bounds of possibilities, or highways engineers, or all of the other people who like to throw spanners in the works.
Bob, thank you very much indeed. That's just terrific.
Okay.
Thank you. A hand for Bob Tomlinson, please.